Welcome to part 1 of my Geopolitics with the Gods series. If you haven't watched my introduction video to this series, then you should do that first. It is in the playlist. This series is for people that want to dominate in the fields of investing, geopolitics, and political risk. My method to dominate these fields is a work in progress, and this series will be updated and possibly revised as time goes on. Some of the ancients used the gods as a form of risk management, so this isn't a new concept, but it does seem like it has been lost to time. The gods represent specific things, so part 1 of my method is simple, but it will take some time. This video will be split up into 8 different god archetypes. Your goal is to become familiar with the gods and internalize what they represent. Memorization is not going to be enough for this method that I have created. You really need to internalize the gods and know what they represent like they are the back of your hand. The more gods you know, then the better off you will be. This is how you will become super efficient in these fields. This video is only covering Western European gods and Perun. I should also note that these are not the only Western European gods, but they are a good starting point. I will be covering the Hindu and Japanese gods in another video. I am also working on the Slavic, African, and South American gods. There are multiple gods under each archetype that represent slightly different things. At the bare minimum, you should internalize at least one god from each archetype. This means 8 gods in total. Take your time with part 1 because part 2 is going to require more internalization. Part 2 should technically be part of this video, but I thought it would be a bit overwhelming, so I decided to split this method up into pieces. I will start this video now. The first archetype that we have is sovereignty, authority, and state legitimacy gods. Our first god is Zeus, who represents supreme authority, law, order, and elite consensus. Our next god is Jupiter, who represents institutional authority, imperial order, and treaties. Tyr is the next god who represents law, contracts, and rule-binding sacrifice. Odin is the next god who represents strategic authority, elite knowledge, and statecraft. The Dagda is the next god who represents kingship, legitimacy, and prosperity tied to rulership. Our next archetype that we have is war, security, and coercive power gods. Ares is our first god for this archetype, who represents chaotic violence and uncontrolled escalation. Athena is the next god who represents strategic warfare, defense, and planning. Mars is the next god who represents disciplined violence and national mobilization. Thor is the next god who represents defensive force, internal security, and popular protection. We have Perun, who represents storm power and warrior kingship. The next archetype that we have is law, justice, and institutional trust gods. Our first god is Themis, who represents natural law and moral legitimacy. Then we have Dike, who represents procedural justice and fairness. Forseti is the next god who represents mediation and legal consensus. Nemesis is the next god who represents retributive balance. Economy, resources, and material stability gods are the next archetype. And our first god is Demeter, who represents food security and agricultural stability. Next we have Ceres, who represents state-managed provisioning. Then we have Plutus, who represents wealth concentration. Then we have Hades and Pluto, who represent hidden wealth, extraction, and debt. Then we have Freyr, who represents prosperity, trade, and fertility. Our next god archetype is information, ideology, and narrative control gods. Our first god is Hermes, who represents communication and trade of information. Apollo is the next god who represents truth, forecasting, and technocratic legitimacy. Bragi is our next god who represents storytelling and cultural narrative. Loki represents disruption, manipulation, and chaos injection. Our next archetype is social stability, mood, and collective emotion gods. So our first god for this archetype is Hera, who represents social order, marriage, and internal cohesion. Hestia is the next god who represents domestic stability and internal peace. Eirene represents peace as an active condition. Hel represents social stagnation and decay without violence. Our next archetype is fate, systemic risk, and irreversibility gods. So we have the Norns, who represent structural destiny and path dependence. Then we have the Fates, who represent hard constraints. Then we have Kronos, who represents time pressure. Our next archetype is collapse, transformation, and renewal gods. So we have Ragnarok, who represents systemic reset. We have Dionysus, who represents loss of restraint and mass intoxication. And next we have Janus, who represents transitions and bifurcation points. This is the end of part 1. Thanks for watching. Have a fantastic day or night.